Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data.
Hello and welcome to episode 39. Today we're going to have a look at the 2nd Hussar Regiment in Vivian's Brigade in 1815. This is the 18th Hussars, or to give them their cumbersome full title, the 18th King's Irish Regiment of Light Dragoons Hussars. Raised in 1759 by the Marquis of Drogheda, they were still sometimes referred to as his regiment, even in the Napoleonic period. For example, here's an official document from 1815. The 6 troops of the regiment taken to Flanders in 1815 comprised just 15 combatant officers and 438 other ranks. Now, this number 438 leads to a unique and very interesting feature about the 18th Hussars. After Waterloo, when it was decided that for the first time ever, every British soldier at the battle was to be awarded a medal, the order was sent to every regiment to submit a list of the eligible men, so that a medal could be produced with each man's name inscribed around the rim. I won't go into detail here. The Waterloo medal roll should probably be its own episode sometime in the future. But in brief, there was considerable confusion and irregularity in terms of which men should be included on the rolls. Some regiments included men who'd been killed in action, others did not, and so on. The 18th Hussars paymaster, or adjutant, or whoever it was responsible for the creation of their list of men, was more thorough and cautious than any other regiment. Their roll distinguished between men in the actual fighting and men in the rear echelons, on other duties, or absent for some other reason. This makes fascinating reading as it gives a unique insight into the number of men occupied in the rear and the kind of tasks in which they were occupied. So, of the 438 other ranks listed on the medal roll, 56 are noted as not being present. 3 sergeants, 2 corporals and 51 privates. And that's 13% of the total other ranks. We can see here the reasons they were not present. This is an interesting insight into the kind of duties necessary to support a regiment in battle. It does also raise the question of whether we should deduct 13%, possibly even more, from all Waterloo strengths. Something to discuss another time. The regiment was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Sir Henry Murray, aged 31 in 1815, and had just 14 other officers present, less, I think, than any other regiment at Waterloo. The 6 troops present in Flanders were as shown here. Of its 6 troop captains, only 4 were present. Ellis was absent sick, and Kennedy was back in Brussels with a bruised leg after his horse had stepped on him. Finally, the regimental adjutant is worth a mention. Born in Brabant in the Low Countries, Henri Duperrier had served in Flanders under the Duke of York in the 1790s and been severely wounded in the action of Cattau, receiving 3 musket balls in the right leg and his left arm broken, having been clubbed by a musket butt. He rose to be regimental sergeant major in the 10th Hussars, with whom he served through the Corunna campaign, being commissioned in 1813 and becoming adjutant in the 18th Hussars. As well as English, he spoke his native French and Flemish, as well as German. A truly extraordinary man, it seems. We'll hear more from him later. But let's start now by finding out where these men were from. We can see that the regiment, known as the Irish Light Horse, was certainly predominantly Irish in origin. 249 Irish, then 157 English, 10 Scottish, 9 Welsh and 6 foreigners. 2 from the West Indies, 2 from Gibraltar, 1 man from the United States and 1 Italian. In terms of counties, we can see that by far the most common source of recruits was Dublin. Perhaps surprisingly, with it being the home of the regiment at Drogheda, Fermanagh has less than half the men of Dublin. Wiltshire gets a rare look in as the most common English county, The reason there aren't that many Irish counties here is that there was an even and broad spread of recruiting across Ireland, with a handful of men from pretty much every county. The data available for the 18th is fantastically complete. Of the 381 other ranks in action, there's a birth date for 374 of them, so 98%. We can see that the most common birth year was 1791, so 24 years old at Waterloo, with a mean of 1788, so 27 in 1815. The data for enlistment is complete, with a date for every one of the 438 men. It shows that in terms of years of soldiering, the regiment was a little different to the 10th Hussars we looked at last time. While the 10th's most common year of enlistment had been 1813, with a mean of 1809, the 18th were more experienced, with 1809 being the most common year and 1808 their mean. What did these years of service comprise? Well, the 18th, like all the British Hussar regiments at Waterloo, had made 2 trips to the peninsula. First with the disastrous Corunna campaign in 1808-1809, and then a return in 1813, which lasted until the end of the war in 1814. At the Battle of Vittoria in June 1813, Wellington had won a great victory which turned the tide of the war, sending the French into a retreat that would only end on French soil and with Napoleon's abdication in April 1814. However, the victory could have been even more decisive had much of the British cavalry not abandoned its pursuit of the fleeing French in order to plunder the French treasury wagons and get drunk in the town. Wellington was understandably furious. The war in the peninsula could have been effectively ended there and then, and instead he rode into town to see soldiers of the 18th Hussars stumbling drunkenly around the streets. Although he was furious with all the plundering troops, he singled out the 18th Hussars for special contempt. In a dispatch written home, he refers to the men of the 18th as being a disgrace to the name of a soldier, and that he would take their horses from them and send the men home to England if they would not behave. 3 days later, he would write another dispatch to Earl Bathurst, in which he makes his now famous or infamous reference to British soldiers as being the scum of the earth. The 18th Hussars remained on a yellow card for the rest of the campaign, the threat of being sent home should there be any further misbehaviour hanging over them. Fast forward to June 1815, and one can wonder whether Wellington's perception of the Hussar regiments in Vivian's brigade was in his mind when he chose to position them on the furthest periphery of the battlefield. The 10th had had their new complement of officers after the previous year's Colonel Quentin scandal, and the 18th with its card marked after Vittoria. Let's now join these men in Flanders in June 1815. On the 17th of June, during the retreat from Quatre Bras, the regiment skirmished with the French. Lieutenant Henri de Perrier, the Belgian officer and adjutant, describes the fighting.
In an instant, the cavalry fell on us, on all sides. The rascals began to shout at a fine rate, and fell on us at all corners. It began at the same moment as a most tremendous shower of rain, the hardest that I ever experienced, with loud claps of thunder, accompanied with the French artillery, who began sending the shells very heavily among us at that moment. We lost only one man.
Sergeant Matthew Colgan from Killederry, Kings County, recalls the same individual being hit.
The first shot they fired knocked over a man on my right in the squadron I belonged to and killed him on the spot.
It's satisfying to be able to identify this unfortunate man. The musters show just one man lost on the 17th of June, Private Thomas Spraggs from Leighton in Essex. He would have been around 23 years old. The regiment spent the downpour of the night of the 17th of June bivouacked at Verd-Cocu, a small hamlet to the north-east of the battlefield, while a picket under Captain Grant was thrown out around the 3 hamlets to its south. On the 18th of June, as we heard in the previous episode, the brigade spent all day at their post on the extreme eastern edge of the Allied line. They could hear the sounds of the great battle taking place, but other than occasional glimpses through the smoke, saw little, if anything. It must have been an eerie and perhaps frustrating experience. Lieutenant Colonel Murray recalls,
"No distant object could at any time be seen, and it was one of the annoyances of the moment that you were so completely in the dark as to what was going on, whilst you knew a great deal was going on of great importance."
Occasionally, a staff officer would arrive seeking any news of the much hoped for arrival of the Prussians, and these officers brought much sought after news of the fighting in the centre. Major Henry Percy, for example, one of Wellington's ADCs, brought the news of the fall of Sir William Ponsonby, cut down leading the Union Brigade, and also the supposed death of Colonel Frederick Ponsonby of the 12th Light Dragoons. To occupy the men, and presumably to relieve the discomfort and boredom of standing still on the same spot all day, the men were regularly ordered to change formation, moving from columns into line and so on, and then told to dismount, then mounting again. Eventually, in the early evening, the brigade was moved to a position south of Mont Saint-Jean. Here, the Hussars came under French artillery fire, but Sergeant Colgan was unbothered.
The French guns opened up on us, but they were harmless, having no effect further than dashing the earth in our faces, some falling short and others overreaching us.
Around 7 o'clock, the brigade moved westwards to the centre of the Allied line. The 18th suffered first from the fire of Allied guns, who mistook the Hussars for French, and Vivian sent a messenger to remedy this confusion. The fire from the actual enemy was more troublesome, but again, the rise of the land protected the 18th from the worst of it. Sergeant Colgan tells us,
The balls passed through the intervals, and the summit of the rising ground on which our pivots rested sheltered us in a great degree. Otherwise, no cavalry could have remained motionless for any time under such a torrent of small arm fire as played on us at the time.
Standing in position, still waiting as they'd done all day, but now with the deafening roar of battle all around them, unable to see almost anything through the thick smoke in the failing light, the fraying nerves of the men of the 18th were at snapping point. Sergeant Colgan looked at his men.
It was painfully apparent, from the groans which escaped from some and the agonised expressions on the countenances of others, how greatly we were tired, waiting so long for the striking point, and how much our courage was taxed.
But eventually, at long last, the bugles began to call the advance, and the 18th spurred their horses forward. Sir Hussy Vivian led the brigade, descending into the valley between Hougemont and La Haye-Sainte. Sergeant Colgan recalls,
The first regiment I saw during our rapid advance was the 10th Hussars. Many of them were stretched out, killed and wounded by our guns, whose fronts they must have crossed on the ground we passed over.
Sir Vivian then halted the 18th and took the 10th Hussars forward to charge the enemy, ordering the 18th to remain where they were in support. Vivian then returned to collect the 18th, bring them forward, calling out,
18th, my lads! You will, I know! Follow me!
To this, Sergeant Major Thomas Jeffs called out,
By Jesus, General, anywhere! To hell, if you leaders!
Both regiments then advanced, the 10th to the right, the 18th on the left. The 18th crossed the paved chaussee which led from La Belle Alliance up to La Haye-Sainte. Lieutenant Colonel Murray recalls the noise of so many hooves clattering over the stone road. Vivian writes,
The 18th were then directed towards the left against some of the cavalry of the Imperial Guard, drawn up in front of La Belle Alliance. Some French horse artillery attempted to gallop away across the front of the regiment, but were overtaken, the gunners and drivers cut down, and the guns secured. The 18th then charged the cavalry and completely dispersed them, and also drove some more artillerymen from their guns, the whole flying in disorder.
Lieutenant Colonel Murray also recalls these retreating French guns, but that he ordered the young French artillery drivers to be spared.
Some French artillery made a push to cross us at a gallop, but it would not do. We were on them. I ordered the guns to be secured and the drivers not hurt.
This artillery train was more of an obstacle to the Hussars' advance than a foe to be attacked. The British cavalry simply could not get past. Sergeant Colgan resolved to sort out the confusion and create a path through the horses and limbers that stood in their way.
I galloped up to the outrider or driver on the foremost horse of one of the guns in my front, and as he was only a boy, I knocked him off his horse with the flat of my sword and held the reins of his horse until my party had made the gap secure.
Lieutenant Duperrier, writing shortly after the battle, recalls the 18th meeting with this combined force of French cavalry, a mix of cuirassiers and other corps, also mixed up with the artillery, and that the 18th ruthlessly drove this motley force from the field.
In an instant, we fell on the cavalry, who resisted but feebly, and in running, tumbled over their own infantry. From that, we came on the artillery, who was not better treated by the Irish lads in their attentions.
Next, the regiment fell upon a field of retreating French infantry. Murray recalls being impressed by the rather calm manner in which many of these French troops were retiring.
Soon we came into ground entirely covered with French infantry retreating, not in a body, but individually, yet with none of the hurry and confusion that might be imagined when thus suddenly ridden in upon. And especially some of the ancien guard might be remarked for their coolness and bold countenance. One nearly bayoneted me as I passed. Numbers of these were cut down, and my orderly, a man named Dwyer, cut down 5 or 6 in rapid succession.
Many of the French infantry began to cry out, "Vive le roi!" thus claiming their loyalty to King Louis and not Napoleon, in an attempt to be spared the sabres of the British Hussars.
But it was too late. Besides, our men do not understand French. So they cut away through all, till we came to the body of the reserve, when we was saluted with a volley at the length of 2 swords.
These were the well-formed French squares of the Imperial Guard. Perhaps among them was the square at which the 10th Hussars had charged in such a brave but futile manner. The 18th's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Murray, was not about to make the same error. He could see there was no prospect of breaking these squares with cavalry alone, and the signal had already been given to retire. No attack was made then, but tragically, while in the process of pulling back to reform, disaster still befell the 18th. Murray tells us,
The charge, as also the previous movements, had been intended with casualty, but retiring with a view to formation proved infinitely more destructive. For as the light was uncertain, they crossed upon some fire, whether the enemies or Prussians, perhaps the latter, which mowed them down many at a time, more than once.
This tragic slaughter took place close to La Belle Alliance. At this point, the building was to the Hussars' right. Murray goes on to describe being initially surrounded by a group of his men, and then finding himself alone, his party all shot down. So, like the 10th Hussars, the 18th had been largely spared serious casualties until almost the very end of the battle. Their tragedy compounded, it seems, by the likelihood that they were shot down by allies in the dimming light and confusion. Exhausted and hungry, the regiment halted and bivouacked for the night. Let's now look at each of the 6 troops and how they fared in the battle. Number 2 troop, Grant's. 69 men, 14 casualties. Lieutenant Charles Hess of this troop was wounded in the arm. Reputed to be an illegitimate son of the Duke of York, 17 years later he would be killed in a duel with the illegitimate son of Napoleon. More on that another day, perhaps. We heard Regimental Sergeant Major Thomas Jeffs of this troop giving a hearty response to General Vivian earlier. From North Lee in Oxfordshire, he was commissioned for his gallantry at Waterloo. He was appointed as a cornet in the 7th Hussars and served 11 years with them before retiring as a lieutenant. Number 3 troop, Croker's, 66 men, 10 casualties. Commanded by Captain Richard Croker, he must have had a fearsome appearance, his face scarred by a severe sabre wound received at Croix de Rade in the south of France. Alongside him in this troop was Private Thomas Roche, Another man with a scarred face, his wound coming at Burgos in 1813. Private Thomas Woodger of this troop from Crawley in Sussex had been taken prisoner in the retreat to Corunna in December 1808. The poor man endured 5 years as a prisoner of war, only rejoining the regiment in July 1814. He survived Waterloo unscathed, but seems to have found it impossible to readjust to military life and was court-martialed 3 times within a year after Waterloo. He then died either of illness or accident in December 1817. A sad tale. Number 5 troop, Legacies. This troop suffered by far the worst casualties, with 9 men killed and 11 wounded. We can assume it was these men cut down at the close of the day by what was probably Prussian fire. In Lieutenant Colonel Murray's account, we heard earlier him mention his orderly, Dwyer, cutting down 5 or 6 French infantry in quick succession. This was Sergeant Jeremiah Dwyer of this troop from Mitchelstown, County Cork. He received a wound in his right shoulder in the battle. Number 6 troop, 10 casualties. We heard in the last episode of the elegant extracts. The 26 officers of the 10th Hussars kicked out of that regiment in 1814 following the court-martial of Colonel Quentin. Captain James Lloyd was one of these officers and now commanded this troop in the 18th. In the previous episode, we saw one of the remarkable watercolours of the surgeon Charles Bell and heard the sad case of Private William Wanstall. Private Thomas Ellard of this troop of the 18th Hussars was the subject of a similarly extraordinary painting. From Kilcullen in County Kildare, he was 30 years old. Bell has captured his mournful look as he lies in hospital with a musket ball wound to his shoulder. This led to the amputation of the arm, but the story has a happy ending. Ellard recovered, and Bell notes that his patient was up and walking about after 3 weeks. Number 7 troop, Luards, 7 casualties. In a letter written after the battle, Captain George Luard said that out of 60 men, he had only 35 at the end of the battle. Interesting and pleasing to see that Luard gives the total of 60 men, exactly the same as collated from the musters, but one can only wonder what happened to the missing men. Perhaps they'd been unhorsed or gone to the rear with wounded officers and men. And finally, number 8 troop, Kennedy's. No men killed, just 4 wounded. With Kennedy absent with his bruised legs, the troop was commanded at Waterloo by Lieutenant William Rowles. He rode a bay horse which was shot through the head during the advance. Although it lost an eye, it not only carried Rowles for the rest of the battle, but later made a full recovery. This troop's trumpeter was James Goodwin. From Bridgetown, Barbados, he was one of 2 black soldiers in the 18th Hussars. The other was Private Thomas James from Montserrat. Sergeant Coghlan mentions General Vivian's entourage at Waterloo, including his black trumpeter, and I wonder if this might have been James Goodwin, sequestered from this troop. If not, it was surely trumpeter William Affleck from the 10th Hussars, who we discussed in the previous episode. So the regiment suffered 25 other ranks killed. At least 40 are known to have been wounded, there are probably a few more. So pretty similar casualty rates to the 10th Hussars in terms of the other ranks, but very different when it comes to the officers. The 18th Hussars lost no officers killed, and just 2 were wounded, Duperrier and Hesse. Very different to the 10th's experience. The morning after the battle, Lieutenant George Woodbury was sent to scour the battlefield for fallen men from the regiment. He found men from his own troop,
several of whom had been wounded and spent the night without help, while we were taking care of ourselves in camp. I am appalled that I could have forgotten, even without orders, these poor lads and neglected the performance of this duty.
The adjutant Henri Duperrier had been wounded in the head by a musket ball. A day after the battle, he wrote to a Major Hughes at the depot at Lewes in England.
I am in great pain, caused by a ball which I received in my head, charging a French battalion with about 40 of our men. It would have killed an Englishman. Having passed through my skull head, opened the skull and out the other side. When I say it would have killed an Englishman, it is because he has brains. But you know that I have none.
Of the wounded men of the 18th, 21 would later be discharged due to their wounds. In addition to Thomas Ellard, who we've already discussed, these included Private Charles Baxter from Achallurcha, Fermanagh, who lost a leg, and also Private Edward Bailey, who was rendered blind from a musket ball. The poor lad was aged just 19. He received an annuity of £6 for his wound and lived the rest of his life at Friday Street, Henley-upon-Thames in Berkshire. He died there in 1869, aged 73. Following Waterloo, the regiment formed part of the occupation, and unlike the other British Hussar regiments, it would remain in this role in France for the duration, that is, until nearly 1819. During this time, there were the usual instances of misbehaviour. Dozens of Waterloo men of the 18th were court-martialled in these years, 13 just from Kennedy's troop, for example, and they usually occurred at a rate of several per week. There were all the typical offences revolving around being drunk and or absent. For example, John Hurst, another man from Achallurcha, Fermanagh, on the 25th of October 1815.
Drunk and absent from parade.
He was sentenced to 200 lashes, but all were remitted. And Sergeant John Larkin, court-martialed in May 1818 for
being late and drinking after hours.
He was sentenced to be suspended from rank and pay for 3 months. In other words, he was paid as a private, not a sergeant, for that time, without actually losing his stripes. Other offences sound more serious, and it was usually the local French population that were the victims. Just a month after Waterloo, Private John Hamilton from Downpatrick, County Down, was court-martialed for theft at Surinat, just west of Paris. He was sentenced to 200 lashes and received all 200. The following year, in June 1816, Private John Murphy was court-martialed for
drawing his sword on and otherwise ill-treating an inhabitant on whom he was billeted.
A few days later, Private John Linton from Newlands, Peebleshire, was one of 4 men of his troop court-martialed for
ill-treating an inhabitant.
All 4 men were sentenced to 300 lashes. Linton, the only Waterloo man, received 100. The other 3 each received 200. Then, in September 1816, at Etaples, Private William Sands from Worthing, Sussex, was court-martialed
on suspicion of attempting to rob a French inhabitant of Longvier.
He was found guilty, sentenced to 350 lashes, and received 250. And so the lists go on and on. As we'll hear in a moment, the behaviour and examples set by some of the officers of the regiment left plenty to be desired. But, of course, riotous behaviour by a gentleman did not result in being flogged. The regiment finally returned to England in November 1818. As usual, it then travelled around the British Isles wherever it was needed to quell social unrest. For example, in 1819 putting down weavers' protests in Carlisle. The 18th Hussars were subject to the same brutal army cuts as faced by most units in the British Army between 1817 and 1819, and lost 105 Waterloo men to reductions in these years. But unlike other regiments we've looked at previously, there was even worse to come for the 18th Hussars. In 1821, it was announced that the regiment was to be disbanded entirely. It was naturally a sad occasion and a bitter end for a regiment that had fought bravely across the peninsula and then at Waterloo. The story goes that the regiment had paid the price for an indiscreet toast to Queen Caroline of Brunswick in the officers' mess one evening, and when word of this reached the Prince Regent, whose acrimony towards Caroline knew no bounds at this point, he'd ordered the regiment to be disbanded. However, I doubt there is much, if any, truth in this. There are similar stories for other regiments affiliated with the Queen. The 16th Light Dragoons, for example, were said to have been sent to India for the same reason, according to another tale. Also, the 18th were not alone in being disbanded. The 19th Lancers and other regiments were ordered to be broken up in the same announcement. If anything did influence the decision to disband the 18th, it was possibly a string of embarrassing court-martials of its officers during the occupation. In August 1816, while stationed at Seymour, France, not far from Boulogne, Lieutenant Thomas Pryor, a tall Irish officer from Queen's County in Loard's troop at Waterloo, was court-martialled for
disorderly conduct at the theatre, causing a disturbance and an affray,
and was sentenced to 6 months' loss of rank. Then, in July 1817, Captain James Grant, commanding No. 2 Troop at Waterloo, was court-martialled at Whitehall for using
provoking, obnoxious and insulting language to a Department of Commissary General.
He was sentenced to be publicly reprimanded and admonished. And then, in an echo of the squabble between colonels in the 10th Hussars in the Colonel Quentin scandal, there was the trial in February 1819 for fraud and misappropriation of funds of Lieutenant Colonel Hay, who commanded the regiment in the depot in England while the regiment was away, prosecuted by Colonel Murray, the regiment's commander in the field in the Peninsula and Waterloo. Like most trials of fraud, the case was complex and often quite banal. A key part of the case revolved around a payment for new underpants for the men while in Spain. As with the Quentin case, the impression is that there was considerable evidence against the defendant, yet despite this he was found not guilty, and the Prince Regent then turned his fury against the plaintiff. Colonel Murray receiving a humiliating public rebuke for bringing the case and placing the blame firmly at his feet. The lessons of the Quentin trial had not been learnt. Officers should not embarrass the service, and by extension the King, by bringing actions against commanding officers. In an age where the ruling classes felt threatened enough, this simply would not do. So, the regiment was disbanded on the 10th of September 1821 at Newbridge, County Kildare. We can see here all the reasons that men were discharged following Waterloo. Of the 114 men discharged on the disbandment of the regiment, 28 are known to have been transferred into other cavalry regiments, the 4th Light Dragoons receiving the majority, and some into the 7th Hussars. Of the 76 men unaccounted for, it's very likely that a large number also transferred into the 4th Light Dragoons on disbandment, and then died in India, that regiment being posted there from 1822 to 1841. I found several Waterloo men of the 18th in the burial ledgers in India, and more digging is required to find the rest, I expect. Among the men who transferred into the 4th Light Dragoons was No. 8 Troop's black trumpeter James Goodwin. He arrived with that regiment in India in August 1822 and served there for the next 18 years. He became Trumpet Major, the sergeant in charge of all the trumpeters, and served in the campaigns in Sindh and Afghanistan from 1838 to 1840. After this extraordinary career, he was discharged and returned to London, where he collected his pension, living at St Clement's Inn off the Strand. Now, just 3 weeks ago, from the time I'm recording this, the Guardian newspaper ran a story about this wonderful painting held by the National Army Museum, and how historians had identified the man as Private Thomas James of the 18th Hussars at Waterloo. This was the other black soldier in the regiment. He was among the 56 Waterloo men listed as not present, being with the baggage. I would humbly suggest that without a specific indication on the painting that this was Thomas James, then it might be more likely to be trumpeter James Goodwin. He's wearing a trumpeter's uniform and had an extremely long and distinguished career, and was possibly even Vivian's personal trumpeter at Waterloo. One quite large spanner in the works for my thesis, however, is the fact that the soldier in the painting holds a pair of small cymbals rather than a trumpet. So, who knows? A fascinating mystery. Maybe we'll never know for certain, or perhaps more research will provide a definitive answer. But whoever he is, what an extraordinary life he must have had. 3 Waterloo men of the 18th Hussars were commissioned, an Englishman, Irishman and Scotsman. Regimental Sergeant Major Thomas Jeffs we've already heard about, becoming the adjutant in the 7th Hussars. Then Sergeant Joseph Cruess from Tipperary was commissioned as an ensign in the 92nd Foot, the Gordon Highlanders, in January 1816. And finally, Troop Sergeant Major John Collins from Trarant, East Lothian, became the 18th's quartermaster in 1817. Pretty impressive to have 3 men from the ranks from such a small group all rise to become officers. And what of some of the other officers? Lieutenant George Woodbury really requires an entire episode to cover his extraordinary life, and maybe that's something I'll try to do at some point in the near future. Born in Worcester, he left the army after the regiment's disbandment and sailed to South America, where he became a key figure in Simon Bolivar's War of Independence against Spain. As I say, more on him sometime soon, I hope. Lieutenant William Rowles, commanding No. 8 Troop at Waterloo, came to a sorry end, becoming first blind and then, in 1834, officially declared insane. Henry Duperrier retired to Cornwall, living at Millar, where he died in 1846, aged 75. And Lieutenant Colonel Murray retired to Wimbledon Lodge, where he died in 1860 and is buried at St Mary's Church, Wimbledon. And who was the last man standing of the regiment? One contender would be Private William Keevers in No. 6 Troop at Waterloo, from Margate in Kent. Born in 1790, he enlisted in the 18th Hussars in 1810 and served through the latter years of the Peninsular War, present at Vittoria, Pamplona, the Pyrenees, Orthez and Toulouse. He served up to the regiment's disbandment and probably, like many of his comrades, found it hard to make a living and find reliable work in Civvy Street. He therefore re-enlisted, this time as an infantryman in the 3rd Foot, the Buffs. With this regiment, he sailed to New South Wales, which he must have taken a shine to, as when the Buffs returned to England in 1827, he transferred into the 57th Foot so that he could remain in Australia, and then did the same again in 1831, transferring into the 17th Foot. In 1833, he was discharged at his own request, taking advantage of the offer of a gratuity of £36, a substantial sum, which enabled him to purchase land at West Dapto near Wollongong, which he named Hussar Farm. He died in 1871, aged 81. His Waterloo medal is now in the Canberra War Museum. So let's end the 18th Hussars there. The regiment was reformed in 1858
and existed until 1922,
when it was merged with the 13th Hussars to form the 13th 18th Royal Hussars, in brackets Queen Mary's Own. I hope you found this episode interesting. Please click like and subscribe if so, and share it with anyone mad enough to possibly also be interested. Enormous thanks as always to the kind volunteers who do such a fantastic job in reading the extracts. In this episode it was particularly great to have contributions from ex-members of the 13th 18th Hussars, Bill Swampy Moore and Martin Berkely. Enormous thanks to them. And also thanks to my old friend Tim Paton, who read the lines of Colonel Murray. Tim's father was Colonel of the 13th 18th Hussars, so again, great to have that connection. If anybody listening would like to help out with doing some readings, it's always great to have new volunteers to share the load, so do please get in touch. There's an email on the blurb here. Speaking of emails, I've been trying to work through the many I've received with queries and questions about Waterloo men. I've hopefully replied to most of these now, but if I haven't, please do give me a nudge. If you'd like to express your eternal gratitude and support to the podcast volunteers with a bottle of their choice, do please click on the Buy Me a Coffee feature. Many thanks to those of you who've done so already. I won't keep banging on about it, so this will be the last time I mention it, I promise. But anyone who is generous enough to chuck us the price of a beer, do please use Buy Me a Coffee rather than the YouTube's super thanks. YouTube takes 30% of such donations plus fees and taxes, and that seems a bit cheeky to me. Next time, Gardiner's Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery, so I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, many thanks for watching.